Hi, welcome back. I'm Tila Matthias, one of the managing partners at Phoenix Team, and this is part 9 of our Accessible AI series, where we are exploring all the ways that AI and generative AI are going to transform the way software development works. As always, I'm here with Brian Woodring.
Hey, Tila, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And then I have two guest speakers with us today. John Comiskey and Lindsay Bennett. And I think Brian's going to give us a quick introduction.
Yeah, so where we last left off at episode 8, 7 and 8, Tila and I had really spent time talking about what was the process of bringing Burst to life over that first 100 days, which are so critical in every software product, going from 0 to 1 over the course of a few months. What the process was like of building technology in 2024, and then some of the actual decisions that went into building Burst, which is why it's so exciting to have these two guests in particular. So John Comiskey, an old friend of all of ours, who was really, really involved in the underlying architecture and some of the really incredible technical innovations in Burst. And then Lindsay Bennett, who is not as familiar with the product, who is an amazing product manager and analyst who well, Tila, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Bennett test?
I would. And before I do that, though, maybe John and Lindsay, could you establish a little bit of your street cred? Why should anybody care that you're on here talking about technology? Maybe we'll start with John.
Sure, Taylor. Thank you. So, John Comiskey, technology fellow here at the Phoenix team, and why am I here? I'm here because over the last 3-4 months, I've been spearheading the development of Burst, and in particular, figuring out how to prompt generative AI to give us what we hope and think are going to be some pretty great software requirements and associated artifacts. But that question will hopefully be answered with more authority here in a few minutes as my good friend and colleague Lindsay Bennett will evaluate in real time. Lindsay.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Tila. Thanks, Brian. I'm Lindsay Bennett. I'm a partner here at Phoenix Team, and I have been spending my career um, devising, designing, building, deploying, and caring for software products. And so I'm very excited to be participating in this test. I'm very honored to have a test named after me. So it's a little bit of pressure to have on
Under pressure.
someone, but very much looking forward to seeing the outputs of Burst and discussing a little bit about how it creates really meaningful software requirements and other software artifacts that can help us maximize our value delivery.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for being here with us today. So, the goal today is we're going to perform live and in real time the Lindsay Bennett test. So, what is the Lindsay Bennett test? The Lindsay Bennett test is a variation of the Turing test where we are going to see for the first time what a very experienced product manager and requirements engineer thinks about the quality of the artifacts that we are generating out of Burst. So the hope and the goal is, can we produce requirements and the associated artifacts of software development that are as good or better than a human would? And so that's the Lindsay Bennett test. So why don't we jump in? And while I'm getting that pulled up, Lindsay, have you looked at any of these requirements that I'm going to show you before today?
I have not.
Okay. So my fingers are crossed. I'm going to get logged in. I'm taking us into our dev environment because in the background, we've been feverishly running the Fannie Mae servicing guide through many more of its topics and subtopics. So I'm going to go into the Fannie Mae servicing guide, and this is a job to provide a product manager, an analyst, an engineer with access to all of the information associated with servicing and mortgage, according to Fannie Mae. And I'm going to pick up, I think I'm going to go with default, but I'm going to let Lindsay pick the topic and pick the requirements. So you tell me, Lindsay, where would you like to go today? Here are all your
Well,
choices.
I've had a lot of experience in foreclosure, so let's go with foreclosure management.
Okay, let's take a look. I hope we get requirements. Oh, great, we do. That's good news. So we're off to a strong start. Okay, so what has happened here, and I'll take kind of your first feedback here. What we've done is we've taken all the language as it exists directly in the Fannie Mae Servicing Guide, and we've generated the requirements from the guide. So I'll just kind of give you a few moments here to take a look. And then I will expand. We will look at the user stories, the acceptance criteria, and the test cases.
All right, so we're talking about publishing a foreclosure notice. Very familiar.
And any of these that you want to drill into, you just let me know which one and I'll open it up and we can look at all of the associated details.
All right, let's take it from the top, making sure no publication costs are passed through to the borrower, servicer, or family.
All right. So it looks like we got 5 user stories. And let's take
Right
a
off
look
the
at
bat,
these.
I really like that we're properly formatted to start the user story. So we've got our persona in there identified as a servicer. I must do this thing. And then I also like we have the why statement in there, or the so that. That's the most important part of the user story, in my opinion. So we've got the persona, we've got the what, and we have the why. So looking through as a servicer, I'll just pick the first one. As a servicer, as that persona, I must identify and categorize publication placement service costs separately so that these costs are not inadvertently passed through to the borrower, the servicer, or Fannie Mae. That's perfect. Yep. So now I know I have to track those costs differently than I would any other costs because of the reason why I can't pass it through. And so one of the ways that I would know not to pass them through is separate tracking. Love that. And the second user story looks like a good follow-on to that as well. So maybe one thing we could think of as an enhancement for Burst is dependencies, maybe between user stories.
Oh, that's a good idea. I like that one.
Yeah.
And how they connect.
Yeah.
And so if we look at, let's see, why don't we pick one here? So I must validate invoices for vendors, train my accounting team, audit financial transactions. Are any of these interesting enough to go look at the acceptance criteria, or you want to keep moving on?
Yeah, let's talk about validating invoices from vendors.
Yeah, I like that one too. All right, so let's open that one up. All right, it looks like we got 5 acceptance criteria for this user story. And I guess before we even dig in too deep, I know there's not a perfect answer for this, but, how many acceptance criteria would you say you generally see from an analyst?
Depending on the story, it could be 2, could be a lot. But I like the idea of 3 to 5. I like to follow that rule in most things, 3 to 5 OKRs, 3 to 5 acceptance criteria is a good barometer because it's not too little and it's not too much where you kind of get lost.
So
Not coincidentally, there's 5 AC here.
And how would you say as you're reading these, what do you think?
Yeah, I think these are pretty good starts. There's probably some room for like the 4th one, for example, making sure that our staff are adequately trained. There could be some interpretation there as to the system itself, what the system would need to provide in terms of training, for example. So someone may interpret that a certain way as like a system requirement or system AC versus a organizational AC. So the types of things like that might be worth digging into a little bit more as we continue to refine, and potentially there's AC that could be pulled out there, maybe less technical and more change management, for example. Maybe we have change management stories and acceptance criteria one day.
Well, I think it's also useful, Lindsay, to dig into on some of those into the actual test cases themselves.
Mhm.
Some of that nuance gets actually kind of captured within the test cases that are generated for particular acceptance criteria itself. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, this is perfect. This is great. Like these test cases are really yeah, almost like a change management type of test. You know, like are we doing what we need to do to make sure that our staff is ready for the implementation of this rule or this requirement, which is, you know, sometimes more than half the battle when you're building mortgage software, right? You have to make sure that the organization surrounding the technology is ready um, to support the new process.
That's a really interesting point because you're right. This one could be either or both what the system needs to do, what the organization needs to do. And I agree with you. I think those are frequently omitted and they're put in like the air quotes organizational change management bucket. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a really interesting observation. What would you say from a test case perspective? You know, how often are you seeing test cases come in at the acceptance criteria level? How robust are they? How many do you generally see? Tell us about your experience with test cases in requirements development.
Well, I've been probably less involved on the testing side of things compared to some others here at Phoenix. And I think maybe a future episode would be awesome to have Sean J. Burke join you guys and really speak to the test cases and what makes a good test case and things like that. But having test cases at the AC level, I think, is probably you know, more often than not happening on most projects. And so seeing it at this level of granularity is really nice.
my own kind of personal experience as well is that oftentimes test cases end up getting written by the quality team or by the testing team, and you have an inherent, you know, not inherent, but you end up having a little bit of a disconnect between the analysts who really kind of understand the full context of what the software is supposed to be doing, and then when you have you know, the quality team, sometimes they don't understand that as well as the analysts does. So you end up getting test cases that don't capture some of the nuance of that broader context. And I think that's one of the really powerful things that generative AI brings to the table, because it does. It has that context when it's generating both the test cases and the acceptance criteria.
Yeah. And a good user story with good AC and you know, test cases or not, there's a lot of conversation, John, to your point, that typically happens between the person who wrote the story and the person who's testing the story because, you know, it's you don't have quite the level of detail sometimes in there that you might need for the tester to inherently understand. And so I think this helps shorten those conversations just to have these um, test cases, at least to start the conversation. And maybe they get refined through the conversation or not, but certainly could be a time saver if nothing else.
Oh,
One of the
absolutely.
things-
And they like these help the test community to understand the context, because when they're kind of put before you and your role is to edit slash execute them as opposed to, you know, create them from whole cloth, you get some of the context along the way, so it's almost like the conversation is being imparted from the core artifacts, the base artifacts themselves, which is cool, I think.
Yeah, for sure. The thing I notice here is that these are not necessarily as much traditional like generic software test cases. Try putting in some negative data, you know, how does the system handle volume, things like that. These are really the very most specific level of the business specification, right? Like this is where the level where like, you could actually go design the process that you need to do publication placement based on actually looking at these test cases. They're very functional, and so you could do some amazing functional validation with this.
Yeah, let's go look at a couple others. Let's see. What do we got here? Reimburse the law firm, not begin foreclosure, becomes aware of environmental hazards. Oh, I don't know. Pick one, Lindsay. What do you like?
Oh, I have some friends in the business who love hazards. So let's look at environmental hazards.
Okay, environmental hazards. Hope it's good. All right, so it looks like we got 5 user stories.
All right, I can't resist. Are we feeling hazardous? Sorry, bad joke.
Yep. I especially like this one. As a mortgage servicer, I must update the foreclosure policies to include checks for environmental hazards. Again, just another example of, potential for not user stories in AC to not only really drive your technology development, but also enable you to pull in all the other pieces and parts of making mortgage compliance work or any kind of process work. And you can implement that in an agile process just as well as you can any technology. And often it's better when you do them all together through an agile process, so everybody's got awareness of both the technology change and the business change that's needed.
Fascinating. And then let's see, what else do we have? Because you're right, these are. Let's look at this one, see what we see. I love this. I personally love this one, but we'll see what Lindsay has to
Yeah.
say about it.
Yeah, no, this is great, especially because now it's talking about the system, right? There's definite system test cases in here. And so, halting foreclosure proceedings can be very systematic, right? And that's what these test cases are alluding to primarily, right? The system's going to do this. It's going to take care of something that's, reasonably automated, right? Sometimes things can't be reasonably automated, and this seems to recognize when it makes sense to do it through technology.
So we're getting close on our time, and I'd like to have just a little conversation then about, all right, Lindsay, how did we do? So we've been working on this tirelessly. Tell us the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then maybe JC will have some questions as well.
Yeah, I think overall, I was definitely, I don't want to say pleasantly surprised because we're talking about the work of, John Comiskey here. So yeah, I've worked with him for years and years, and I know that he produces some really amazing architecture and software. So, but it's definitely really nice to see, you know, very granular down to the test case level generated requirements. And it's also really nice to see properly formed user stories because I'm a stickler for persona, action, value. And the fact that, we can slurp in, a regulation or publicly available, guidelines for servicers and come up with this level of detail, you know, in a heartbeat is just, it's kind of mind blowing to think about, right? Because these are things that take a long time for a human to read and then interpret and then understand, how do I convey this to engineers and testers and, how do I derive like the true understanding of value? And there's really a lot of that's completely taken care of through Phoenix Burst. So very excited. This is great.
And I think, so let's talk about the Fannie Mae Servicing Guide as maybe being a proxy for other things. So Fannie Mae Servicing Guide, let's call it 500 pages. And what I just showed you and what we're presently running is generating all the requirements, user stories, acceptance criteria, and test cases from a 500-page document. How long do you think that would take a requirements engineer?
Oh man, a year? I don't know.
You think you think a person, so let's see, could a person do it in a year? I wonder if a person could do it in a year. And also I think one of the things we just talked about was that, well, the requirements engineer isn't going to write the test cases. Somebody else writes the test cases. Should somebody else write the test cases, in your opinion?
Well, I think The test case is, an independent validation, right? Because, you know, if John only tests all his own stuff and nobody else looks at it, like it's probably going to be really good. But there's, there's that element of where you want that second opinion in there. So, you know, again, not being the testing expert, I definitely think there's value in having kind of an independent eye or lens towards validating what we're building.
Yeah, and that's kind of the topic I wanted to explore a little bit. So it's my hypothesis that in the future we won't have these big fat lines between roles. We won't have a tester or a requirements engineer. We'll have a value engineer who is a hybrid role that can do many of the roles. That maybe there is a value engineer, a software engineer, and a customer, and that's the team. And that what we can enable here is a really a much broader, upskilled, reskilled workforce that can do all those jobs. So the value engineer can define what needs to be done and why. The software engineer delivers what needs to be done, and then that value engineer performs that independent role of, well, this is the what and the why, and now I can see that it did it. But I don't have to have that separation of roles. I still have, I think it's the division between a value engineer and a software engineer, I think, because I think those roles right now are still different enough. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely checks the box on, the biggest thing for me, which is just making sure that no one single person goes off in a silo and builds something and expects it to be 100% perfect or right. It does take collaboration, and when we collaborate, we get better results. That's one of my favorite sayings.
And I totally agree with that. But to kind of take the other side of the coin, for the folks who are collaborating, for any individual person who is collaborating, the more they understand about how it all works, right? From the business requirements themselves to the motivation, for the organization that's writing those business requirements and why, right, to source legislation, all the way down to the code that is implementing it for, say, a servicer who is servicing, Fannie Mae held mortgages. That the more you understand, the more that those individuals understand, the better they will be at whatever slice that they're doing. And that to me is maybe the most exciting thing about using generative AI, because it has that understanding, like a hugely broad understanding. And it may not be as good of an understanding as, just an extraordinarily exceptional analyst who really, really knows it. It may not understand it quite as well, but it's going to understand it way, way better than most people will, right? Than most people who are traditionally working on these and collaborating into these types of projects. So to have that, that kind of, I don't know, generated person creating that core, like what Burst is doing to create that core set, and then having people who bring their own specialties to come in and edit and curate it and tweak it, wherever it misses the mark a little bit, and to flesh it out maybe even a little more if that's required. Like, it's just such an incredibly powerful start for a team, right? So, and it just maximizes what you can get out of the collaboration. That to me is the kind of the most exciting, powerful thing I think out of Burst's capability, leveraging Gen AI to create this.
Plus, let's be honest, in the real software world, nobody's got time to write hundreds of test cases. That actually practically just doesn't happen at all in most software projects. So you're a huge leg up just having that at all to begin with.
I agree. And I think what I saw here today that I also really appreciated, and I'm going to have to reflect on this, is I think what we saw is that the machine picked up a wider variety of needs and things that needed to be implemented. So we picked up the system requirements. We also picked up process requirements and change requirements, which I think generally frankly, your requirements engineers skip over those. We say, oh yeah, that's the servicer's job. Well, what if it's not? What if it is our job? What if the job is to deliver value to the organization and to the consumer? Then those are our jobs as well. And so I'm really gonna have to think about what the implication is there. And JC, I'm thinking about a way that maybe in a next gen of our prompt engineering, maybe we pick out process ones and we can, instead of generating those as requirements, we generate those as organizational change requirements.
Sure.
And then I can see those as well. How cool would that be? All right, so I'm going to wrap it up. But Lindsay, how did we do with the Lindsay Bennett test? Would you say we produced requirements that were as good or better than what a requirements engineer could produce?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. All right.
Definitely.
Round of applause to John Comiskey.
Well
Lindsay
done.
Bennett. Lindsay Bennett, thank you for being here today. Brian, John, and Lindsay, all three of you, really appreciate it. And I'm going to sign off for today. I'm Tila Matthias. This has been episode 9 of our Accessible AI series. And thanks for joining. We'll see you next time for episode 10, where we wrap up our series. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.